All right. If I could please have your attention. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask about any of the material that we've covered up till this point in time? I also want to let you know that your papers will be returned to you on Wednesday after class. So we'll end class about 5 minutes early on Wednesday so that there's enough time to distribute the papers. All right? So what I want to do now is I want to continue my discussion of the Bhakti movement. I'm not going to spend too much time on it, another 10-15 minutes, and then I want to move on to the beginning of the Mughal Empire from 1526 onwards. But let me, as I very often do, let me just refresh your memory about what I'd been speaking to you, about in my previous lecture, and continue the narrative from there. So I had essentially been talking to you about Guru Nanak and the founding of the Sikh religion. And remember that one of the things I had done was I had described the milieu, the social religious milieu of those times, and was suggesting to you that in part Guru Nanak should be viewed as part of that milieu, which includes people like Kabir, right? So Kabir and Guru Nanak would be instances of what I have described as the Nirgun poets, or really the more appropriate word would be sons, that is bhaktas, the great devotees, the great religious teachers, right? That's partly the milieu. Part of the milieu is the expansion of Islam, that Islam has been around in India now for 4 or 5 centuries at this point in time, and as I said, there are a number of different arguments about how it is that Islam spread. Okay, so that's the setting that we're really looking at in the 1400s and in the 1500s. And if you recall, what I'd mentioned to you about Bhakti is that this is a movement that originates in the south of India, in the Tamil country, and then gradually you're going to find exponents of Bhakti, throughout the rest of the country. So you can think of it as a kind of a pan-Indian movement. Okay, which is not to say that you should think of it in the way in which you think of pan-Indian gods, such as Vishnu. So that is that if you look at Vishnu and Shiva, these are what you would call pan-Indian gods who are worshipped all over India by many different names, right? But when I say pan-Indian, what I mean is that this flavor of devotion is to be encountered, right? No matter where you go in India. Right? And one of the things that's associated with the rise of Bhakti is the rise of languages, the vernacular languages in India, that the enrichment of these languages takes place side by side with the Bhakti movement. Right? Now 2 of the figures that I want to look at today very briefly before I terminate my discussion of Bhakti are Mirabai and Tukaram. And Mirabai is a woman saint whose renditions of many of the themes of Krishna's life have become legendary, absolutely legendary. I mean, there are actually singers in India who specialize really more or less in a genre of devotional music, which are called bhajans. All right, if you go to YouTube, iTunes, one of these kinds of things, you can find thousands of recordings of bhajans. Right? Now, to understand her, I think we have to understand a number of other considerations, and that is that there are different forms of God according to a Bhakti poet, according to a devotee. To some, God appears in the form of a child. To some, God appears in the form of a lover. Right? To some, God appears in the form of somebody who's divine and infinite and unknowing. Right? That's the context in which you have to view it. And so if you remember, one of the things I've discussed in this class is the different conceptions of Krishna. So you might recall that I had sort of set up a distinction between the Krishna of mythos and the Krishna of history. And the Krishna of history is the Krishna who is going to be revived in the late 19th century by Indian nationalists who are going to argue that what we need a historical conception of a God who looks more like a Christian God, more like a Semitic God, a proper God. All right? And this is the Krishna of the Bhagavad Gita, because the Krishna of the Bhagavad Gita is offering counsel to the Pandavas. All right? But this is the historical Krishna. This is not the Krishna that is really of any interest to somebody like Mirabai, right? Because what she is interested in is a Krishna of mythos, which is the Krishna that I have described to you as well, the Krishna who is the butter thief, the Krishna who dallies around with the gopis, right? And who lives in this world of Mathura and Vrindavan where they are performing the Ras Leela, the cosmic dance. Okay, that's the Krishna mythos. Now, Mirabai is going to be renowned as a person who is a absolute devotee of Krishna, who believes that she is married to Krishna. Okay. Now, if you look at her worldly life, she has a worldly life, notwithstanding her interest in the Krishna of mythos. So her dates are 1498 to 1546. She's born in a Rajput family, so she's born in a Kshatriya family, in a family of princes and warriors, right? And when she's 4 or 5 years old, her mother dies. She is said to have been devoted to Krishna at a very early age. Now she's going to get married off to a person who comes from a princely family, but she's not really interested in her worldly husband. She's only interested in her cosmic husband, if I may put it this way, because she believes herself spiritually to be wedded to Krishna. Okay? And many of the bhajans that she has are going to be of this kind. I'm going to just enumerate, I'm just going to essentially read out a very short poem. They really have to be sung, and since I don't know how to sing, I'm not going to attempt to do that. But this is why you might want to go to YouTube or iTunes and see if you can find some of these bhajans there. So this is one of the poems that is attributed to Mirabai. I danced before my Giridhar. Giridhar is a name for Krishna. Whenever you encounter a word here, a name that you don't know, it's another name for Krishna. Okay? The gods have multiple names. Vishnu, for example, can be known by 1,000 names. All right? Now, Krishna can be known by many different names. So she says, I dance before my Giridhar. Again and again I dance to please that discerning critic and put his former love to the test. I put on the anklets of the love of Shyam. So that's another name for Krishna. And behold, my Mohan stays true. Worldly shame. This is the critical line here. Worldly shame and family custom I have cast to the winds. I have become indifferent to the norms of everyday life. I don't care about the social conventions, she's saying. Right? And of course, the reason why she's saying is that because everybody is looking at her and saying, this is a mad woman. She's married to this man. She completely ignores her worldly husband. Okay? And in fact, when her husband dies, she is expected to commit sati. Sati is the practice of widow immolation. I'm going to speak about that in much greater detail when we move on to the 19th century, because the British are going to institute a law in order to outlaw, okay, ostracize the practice of sati. And the practice of sati is not widespread. It's confined to very small parts of India and to certain communities. But the practice entailed the following, that when a woman lost her husband, she would also go into the funeral pyre. Okay? And that's called the practice of sati. So it became exceedingly controversial because, of course, the British viewed it as an indication of the fact that the Indians were a barbaric people and that this practice had to be abolished. Right? Now, among Rajput families, it was not uncommon. Right? And there's also another practice which is called Johar, which you should know about simply because when we start looking at the history of India now and during the Mughal period, this is going to come up in the records. You're not going to encounter it in your readings for the most part. But Johar is the practice of widow immolation when it is performed collectively by a group of women. So Johar was committed by Rajput women when it became clear to them that their men had lost a battle and they feared that they would now be taken captives by the Muslims and be converted to Islam. Okay, so these women would collectively perform an act of suicide which is called Johar. Sati, which is actually a very complicated rite and which we don't have the time to really look into in great detail here, is a practice that is performed by a woman individually. okay, not as part of a collective right. Now, Mirabai, when she lost her husband, there was an expectation in her family that she would commit sati, because this gives honor to the family. She didn't do so because she didn't believe herself to be married to this man. She was only married to him in the flesh. And we don't even know if the marriage was consummated, for example, right? So this is the scenario that we're talking about, where this woman is a devotee, a great devotee of Krishna, and she's in some ways opposed to societal conventions. All right? And this is what this line means. Worldly shame and family custom I have cast to the winds. I do not forget the beauty of the beloved, even for an instant. Meera is dyed deeply in the dye of Hari, in the color of Hari. There's a lot of punning going on here in the original, because Hari, dye has to do with color, and Hari is then another name for Krishna, but Krishna is the blue god. Okay? So Meera is dyed deeply in the dye of Hari. Right? Now, there is an anecdote that is told about her, which I want to just read out, because it will give you a very good sense, again, of some of the kinds of arguments that I've been making. You recall my comment to you that in the world of bhakti, the women are supposed to be the great bhaktas, and the true bhakta is always a woman. Okay? Always a woman. Even when it is a man, he's supposed to be appearing in the presence of God in the form of a woman. All right? And this is what the anecdote is. So I'm reading from a little article that I'd written. One of the most famous anecdotes from her life, quite likely apocryphal, but we don't know that for certain, relates a meeting she had in Vrindavan with Jiva Goswami, a renowned Vaishnava of the Chaitanya school. So Chaitanya is another great devotee and bhakta coming from eastern India, from Bengal. Right? Jiva Goswami at first refused to meet with her since she was a woman. Right? Whereupon Mirabai is said to have retorted, quote, I used to think that the Lord Krishna was the only man in Vrindavan, and that all the rest of the inhabitants were gopis. Gopis are the cowherdesses, right? The damsels that Krishna moves around with. Now I've discovered that there's someone else here besides Lord Krishna who thinks of himself as a man. Right? I mean, it's an extraordinary retort to Jiva Goswami. So the world of bhakti that we're describing has to be looked at in the following way. Okay? Because you might be thinking to yourself, all right, this is reasonably good literature, maybe it's interesting, but what does this really tell us about India in the 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th centuries? The way we might want to think about it is that bhakti and the bhakti poets collectively possibly represent what you might describe as the emerging sensibility of Indian culture at that point in time. That if you had to think of religiosity in India, it wouldn't be sufficient to think of religiosity by thinking of the Vedas and thinking of the Gita. The Vedas, of course, no one reads. No one. Even the Gita is read by a relatively small part of the educated elite, for the most part. Okay? Now, the Ramcharitmanas is read. That is the version of the Ramayana story written by Tulsidas, right? I've mentioned him briefly before. And Tulsidas himself is a great bhakta, right? He's a devotee of Ram. Right? So if you're looking at the religious milieu of that time, we're saying that the religious sensibility of India is shaped by these bhaktas. And so when we're trying to study caste, we're trying to study social conventions in India. Now these people were all opposed to caste for the most part. And most of them, not all of them, came, Mirabai, for example, would not fit this description that I'm about to give. Most of them came from low caste backgrounds. Okay? Kabir, whose poetry I read out to you in my last class, is a weaver. Okay? Many Ramananda, one of his teachers possibly, is a cobbler. All right? So these people come from low caste backgrounds, they work in professions which would be considered low caste professions, right? And yet they have helped to shape the religious sensibility, which means that we have to rethink our whole idea of the importance of caste and how caste has worked. I mean, I'm not trying to suggest that these people were able to do away with caste, not even remotely. All right? But I'm saying that there's a constant history of resistance, and some of this resistance to societal conventions, to norms of patriarchy. You know, one of the things that Mirabai is doing is she's paving the way for women to escape marriage. Think of it this way, and this is not unusual. I mean, you know, I'll give you an instance from Western history, just to give you a sense of how complicated these matters can become. Now, there's a scholar by the name of Caroline Bynum Walker, who wrote a book called Holy Fast, Holy Feast, about 25 years ago. And it's really a study of women and their religiosity in the 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th centuries in Europe. Now, one of the things she finds is the presence of anorexia in these women to a very large extent. Why were women becoming anorexic? Because if you were a woman, you had your future was absolutely dictated for you. You had to get married, more or less. That was the road to respectability. Motherhood, wifehood, and so on. Now, if you wanted to escape that, one of the ways you would escape marriage is you would become unattractive. You become completely anorexic. Okay? And she has a discussion of it. So she's taking what appears to us to be a 20th century phenomenon, and she is inscribing it into the 12th, 13th century, suggesting that it was a very political act. Okay? So this is some of the significance of people like Mirabai. And I'm not saying that there were thousands of women who were emulating her. We're not trying to make that argument. But what we're trying to suggest is that what Mirabai is doing is she's saying that, look, there are ways in which we can try to escape these social conventions, right? And for women, that would include things like domesticity and marriage. And of course, there's a criticism of caste. And to give you an illustration of that, I'm going to move to Tukaram. But before I do so, here's a poem from a woman called Mahadevi Yakka, 12th century. Okay? 12th century Bhakti poet writing from South India. And this is what she says. Husband inside, lover outside, I can't manage them both. Okay? So here's my husband, he's got all these demands on me, and then I've got a lover, but the lover here doesn't mean a lover in the flesh. It means God, the divine one. I can't manage them both. I'm going to make a choice, okay? And let's put it in colloquial terms, she's going to dump the husband. All right? This world and that other, I cannot manage them both. Right? This is 12th century. Mirabai is 300 years later. But it's the same sensibility that she's expressing. Okay? And let me now move very briefly to Tukaram. And I'm going to begin with a couple of his poems and then give you his biography in short, and that will wind up our discussion of the Bhakti poets. Tukaram is among the last in the great line of the Bhakti poets, because with his death, effectively, what we're going to find is that now Bhakti is diminishing by the 17th century. So he's really, as I said, the last. He's writing in Marathi, the significance of which again needs to be underscored. He's not writing in Sanskrit. In fact, this is going to be a matter of great controversy. The Pandits are going to be furious at him because he's writing sacred literature in a language other than Sanskrit. Okay? So this is an illustration of one of Tukaram's poems. I'm going to give you two of them very briefly. This one is called The Brahmin. The Brahmin who flies into a rage at the touch of a mahar. Mahar is an untouchable, a Shudra. That's no Brahmin. The only absolution for such a Brahmin is to die for his own sin. Right? So you can see the protest against the caste system, the protest against the whole idea that there are a group of people who are untouchables. He who refuses to touch a Chandal, Chandal is another name for an untouchable. He who refuses to touch a Chandal has a polluted mind. The things like pollution and purity are in your mind. It's not that somebody is in fact polluted or pure. This is an aspect of how you think. Says Tuka, a man is only as chaste as his own belief. Right? And here's another very short one. It's a scandal. Big people and small slander me. I've lost my community. All doors are slammed in my face. This is my lot. I accept it. Right? He's saying that he's been ostracized. Everybody is shutting the door in his face. Says Tuka, God has done what's best for me. Right? So you leave things in the hand of God. And this is why, one of the reasons why, of course, they're called Bhakti poets. So let me just give you a little bit of the biography of Tukaram. He's born in 1608, dies in 1649, comes from a family in what is today called Maharashtra in Western India, from a low-caste Shudra family. Okay, although that's again is a little bit misleading, because in Western India and Maharashtra at that time, if you were not a Brahmin, you were considered a Shudra. Right? So in other words, the Shudra category is a very large category at that point in time. Right? It illustrates the difficulties of trying to understand this caste system simply by saying that there's something called the Brahmins, something called the Kshatriyas, and the Vaishyas, and the Shudras. That's the textbook view. In actuality, on the ground, caste relations are always enormously complicated, right? As I tried to suggest to you very briefly before, right? So he comes from a Shudra family, but Shudra here, as I said, means in fact effectively non-Brahmins, and in fact actually his family were landowners, although not immense landowners, right? But nonetheless, they were able to make their living by selling the produce of the land. Okay. Now, Tukaram's father is going to die very early on, and so he takes charge of the family. By the time he's 21 years old, he is the father of 6 children. Marriages were very early in India at that point in time. They were quite early in Europe as well, incidentally. All right? So one shouldn't assume again that this is particular to India, but they were spectacularly early. And in fact, there used to be a tradition in some parts of India, particularly in the village tradition, where in fact an arrangement might be made for a boy and a girl to be married when they're infants. That is, the arrangement is made by the parents of the respective children, right? Okay. So by the time, as I said, he's 21 years old, he has already fathered 6 children. But a few years later, there's going to be a famine. He's going to lose his first wife and some of his children. That's one of the reasons why people, of course, had many children. You lost a lot of your children, to things like famine and to other kinds of natural calamities, disease, so forth and so on. Now he's going to turn to these poetic compositions sometime in his 20s, which are inspired by his devotion for the family deity. The family deity is called Vithoba. And this is again another illustration of an argument I've been making in this class a number of times, that you have these great traditions and then you have these little traditions. You've got little gods. Vithoba, by the way, is not such a little god, but what we're saying here simply is that there are these local traditions, and so if you're living in North India, right, or in South India, you might actually have no idea who Vithoba is, right? But this is the family deity that they've accepted is called Lord Vithoba. And Tukaram, and this is where the hagiography comes in. Remember, hagiography is a style of writing about the saints which puts their life in a certain mold. You have miracles, you have signs of auspiciousness, right? So according to the biography of Tukaram, he is said to have been visited in his dream by Namdeo, who's another great saint of the 13th century, and by the Lord himself, right? And he is told that his mission is to, in fact, write these abhangs. So abhangs are these compositions, right? These devotional compositions. He writes these devotional compositions, and he writes them in Marathi, which is the spoken tongue, rather than in Sanskrit. The Brahmins get highly offended because he's not using Sanskrit and he's not supposed to write abhangs in Marathi, and they compel him to throw the manuscripts of his poems into the river, which flows by the place where he was living, and taunt him that if in fact he is a true devotee of God, these manuscripts will reappear on the surface. And I think you know the rest of the story. They do reappear because he is a true devotee of God, right? That's how hagiographies work, all right? Okay? So this is the kind of life that we're really talking about, right? And I'm not going to give you the rest of the detail, but you get a sense of the importance, right, from the 2 short poems that I've read, that again he flouts social conventions, is indifferent to the material world. Right? It's also a protest against the increasing materialism of society that is already prevalent from the point of view of somebody like Tukaram. So what you want to do when you think about these great poets is, as I said, think of the larger kinds of themes, the milieu in which they appeared. What kind of religious sentiments did they have? What is the kind of religiosity that they represent? And could it be that this is the religiosity which has been the true gift of Indian civilization? Okay? Rather than simply thinking of the Vedas, the Upanishads, right, the Bhagavad Gita, because if you look at Hindu nationalist thinking, they have always dwelled on that part of the story rather than on these great bhakta poets, whose bhajans and devotional songs are known all over India, right? I mean, and these have been committed to memory. They've been committed to memory. They're people who are entirely illiterate, who can reel off bhajans by Meera Bai and songs by Tukaram, right, without any difficulty whatsoever. Right? This is the context that I think you need to keep in mind. Now, let us return back to the political narrative, okay? The political story. And the point at where I left off was the Delhi Sultanate, okay, in the north, the Vijayanagar Empire down south, okay? And it is the year 1526 that Babur is going to defeat Ibrahim Lodi, who is the founder of the Lodi dynasty, and the Lodi dynasty is one of the dynasties that together make up what is called the Delhi Sultanate. Okay, so it's the year 1526, on 19 April, that there's going to be a battle. It's going to be a battle fought at a place called Panipat. Okay, and many battles have been fought, and Panipat, it's a battlefield, effectively a battlefield, since so many battles have been fought there. Not that places are designated as battlefields, but a battlefield slightly north of Delhi, right? Okay, and many battles were fought here that became crucial in shaping the history of India. So there's going to be a battle between Ibrahim Lodi and Babur is going to defeat Ibrahim Lodi. We're going to look at the circumstances under which he defeats him. But before we do that, I have to say something in general about Babur and about how we need to start thinking about the Mughal Empire. Okay? Because the Mughal Empire, at its height, is possibly the greatest empire in the world. Right? The closest, the equivalent empires that we can think of about are the Safavids in Persia at the time of Babur, 1526. Right? The Safavids, the person who's ruling there is Shah Ismail. You have the Ottomans, Salim I, and you have the Mings of China. Okay? And these three empires, the Safavids, the Ottomans, and the Mughals, are collectively known, by the way, just so that you should know, they're collectively known as the gunpowder empires, or the Islamic gunpowder empires. All right? Now, the Mughal Empire is going to last, well, either until 1707 or the mid-1700s or 1857, depending on which perspective you take. Officially, it is going to come to an end in 1857. So we're talking about from 1526 to 1857, that's 330 years, right? Some people have argued that effectively it comes to an end with the death of the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb in 1707. And some people would argue that it effectively comes to an end at the Battle of Plassey, in a manner of speaking, although the Mughals themselves were not really involved in the battle, which is going to be fought in 1757, which is going to inaugurate British rule in India. So you want to keep all of these three dates in mind. I mean, for the first time, I'm going to actually ask you to keep three dates in mind, right? Because we're going to try to understand why is it that we can think quite differently about when the Mughal Empire is going to end. But before we get to the narrative about its ending, let's begin with the beginning and how the Mughal Empire actually came about and what is its significance. And in order to underscore its significance, you might want to think about what are the pillars of this empire. That is, how is this empire sustained? What were the strategies used by the Mughal emperors, okay, to sustain this empire? The things that you might want to keep in mind are the following. Number one, the Mughal emperors create a system of alliance with the Rajputs. So the Rajputs are the great warriors in Rajasthan, modern-day Rajasthan, right, to the west of Delhi, right, the great Kshatriya rulers there, and they're going to create a system of alliances. So Akbar, for example, is going to marry a Rajput woman. Okay? And when I say system of alliances, it's also to be understood in the following sense, that when these Rajput rulers are defeated by the Mughal emperors, they don't simply annihilate them or kill them. They're going to, in fact, absorb them within the empire. Okay? So the system of alliances is both through marriage and it's through military triumph, where you say that I'm going to honor the person I've defeated. Right? And so, of course, what it makes him loyal to the emperor. So system of alliances. Secondly, related to the first point in some ways, a policy of toleration. I mean, as a general argument, and I'm not going to try to defend it today for you, but it can be argued, and I just put this argument forward for your consideration, that empires in some ways have historically been more tolerant than nation states. Okay? And there is a policy of toleration which is widely accepted by most of the Mughal rulers. One of the reasons why Aurangzeb may have been responsible, at least according to the conventional view, for the decline of the Mughal Empire is that you begin to see him moving away from the policy of toleration that his predecessors had put in place. But nonetheless, for 150 years, there is but no question, okay, that the policy of toleration is exceedingly important, and it's what I'm describing as one of the pillars of Mughal rule. And even Aurangzeb's whole period, in fact, is actually quite controversial, and one can make the argument both ways, that he may not have been as intolerant as is commonly supposed. But we'll wait until we get to Aurangzeb himself. Thirdly, the Mughals maintain a balance of power. And when I say a balance of power, I mean it in two ways. One, between the center and regional rulers. Okay? That is that you make the center powerful enough, okay, but you allow a certain degree of autonomy to the people that you have assigned as viceroys to other parts of your empire. You give them a certain degree of autonomy. You give them a certain degree of power, which makes them feel independent, which fills them with dignity. Okay? So he maintains a balance of power between the center and the regional areas. It's also a balance of power between the local and the foreign elements. And when I say local and foreign elements, this will become very clear when we look at the origins, because if you look at Babar, where is Babar coming from? He's coming from Samarkand, okay, from Central Asia. A great lineage in traditional terms. On his mother's side, he is descended from Genghis Khan, the great Mongol ruler. On the father's side, he is descended from Tamerlane, okay, another great ruler from the Central Asian steppes, right, who inaugurated the short-lived Timurid dynasty, as it's called, named after him, Timur. Right? And remember that Timur the Lame, which is the other name by which he is known, or Tamerlane, had come into India, sacked Delhi. I had mentioned that very briefly in about 1398. All right? So Babur is coming from there, and he is coming into India because he is in effect wedged in between the Persians to the west and the Uzbeks to the north. Okay? And this is very important. Why is it very important? Because it's going to explain in part his success. And it's going to explain the brilliance of the Mughals. By which I mean the following, that what Babur is going to bring into India is, on the one hand, the great element of Persian culture, to such an extent that by the early 1600s, it would not be unreasonable to say that Persian was one of the most widely known languages in North India. It was certainly the language of the courts. Now, I was told by a scholar, I haven't actually seen any data to verify this, but I was told by a scholar who's worked on this, that at one point in time there were more books published in Persian in India than in Iran itself. Okay? And we certainly know that Persian was a court language in North India for a couple of centuries. And even when the British came there, until the early 1800s, Persian was the administrative language. Okay? So the Persian element comes in through Babur, right? Because he's highly interested in that. And as I said, Babur himself is in a way wedged in between the Persians and then the Uzbeks. What he brings from the Uzbeks is strategies of military warfare, okay, including the use of light artillery, mobile artillery in particular, which is one of the reasons he's going to be able to defeat Ibrahim Lodi on the battlefield in Panipat in 1526, because Ibrahim Lodi's army was at least 3 to 5 times bigger than Babur's army when they met on the battlefield. And yet he was able to defeat him without any difficulty at all. It had to do with the military strategies that he had learned from the Uzbeks. Babur himself, by the way, is an archer of considerable repute, right? But he has also learned to use mobile artillery. And when I say mobile artillery, it means, of course, artillery that you put on top of a horse and you move it around quickly, okay? So they have learned these military strategies from the Uzbeks. So he brings that from them, and he brings in the elements of Persian administration, literature, culture, and the language itself. And this is going to become part of the heritage of India. Okay? Right? Now, but if you go back to the argument that I'm making about what I described as the balance of power, remember I said that the second way in which we can understand it is the balance between local elements and foreign elements. That is that there is a Turkish-Persian element, but he also is very attentive to people living within India and Indian elites, local Indian elites, and he tries to incorporate them into the empire. So he creates a balance between the foreign and the local elements. Right? So the 3 points I've mentioned so far, the 3 pillars, I said alliance with the Rajputs, which again has to be understood in a number of ways, the policy of toleration, the balance of power. Fourthly, the promotion of the idea of the cult or the personality of the emperor himself. Okay? The cult of the emperor is going to become important. And I want to give you a brilliant illustration of that, if I may. Okay, so there is, in Hinduism, there is a practice. It's called Darsan. All right? The word Darsan, there's a little book by the same name, by Diana Eck, for anybody who's really interested, a very small book of about 100 pages, well worth looking at. The word darshan means gaze, sight. Okay? So in Hinduism, one of the most common practices is what we call darshan. So for example, I might say, I went to Vaishno Devi. Vaishno Devi is a place which is the abode of a goddess, okay, up in the mountains. And it's a very common pilgrimage site, especially in North India. So I might say to somebody, I went to Vaishno Devi to get a darshan of the goddess. In other words, I went there to be able to see the goddess. So darshan means to get a sight of the goddess, or the god, of the deity, whoever the deity might be. Darshan is a bit complicated because it's not only you who's looking at the deity, the god or the goddess, the god and goddess is looking at you too. And they need you to be fulfilled as well. It's not just only you who needs them, right? It's a complicated two-way gaze, if I may put it this way. Now, this is a Hindu practice. Now, in the time of Akbar, the source for this is a book called the Ain-e-Akbari. Okay, the Ain-e-Akbari, which is a huge chronicle of the times of Akbar by his minister. One of his minister's name is Abu Fazl. And in the Ain-e-Akbari, Abu Fazl tells you that Akbar would come out on the balcony of his palace and he would confer darshan on his subjects. Now, by the way, the Muslim clergy were infuriated. They were infuriated because they saw this as a Hindu practice which had come into Islam, and they found it to be a form of idolatry. Right? So we know that there were Muslim clergymen who were very upset and who thought that Akbar was not following Islamic principles at all, that this was heretical. But Abu Fazl is very clear that what Akbar is doing, in effect, he doesn't say that he's taking a Hindu practice, but in effect that is what it is, that he's taking a Hindu practice, he comes and stands there. And what does it mean for him to confer darshan? He is saying to his subjects, you can see me. Okay, you can see that the ship of the state is afloat. Everything is fine with the state, because here I am, the emperor, in my regal majesty, and I'm in front of you. And you can see me. And you should be glad that you can see me. And I'm seeing you, and I'm glad to see you, because I can see my subjects are doing well. Okay? This is the cult of the emperor, right? Which, as I said, was something that the Muslim clergy found to be quite offensive. Right? Fifthly, the fifth pillar of the empire, increasing indigenization. Okay? That is that over a period of time, in many aspects of life, the indigenous element starts to become more and more important. So you begin to see that the architecture change. It begins to include more Hindu elements, for example. Right? This is what I mean by indigenization. And this is what distinguishes the Mughals from the people who have come before. The Mughals have not only come to stay and to establish an empire, they increasingly begin to cohabit with the Indian people and their degrees of indigenization. Okay? And so, and we will also have to think about whether, in this respect, the Mughal Empire is very different, not simply from its predecessors, but from what came afterwards. Did the English, for example, engage in this form of indigenization as the Mughals did? All right? Sixthly, a system of military elites, which probably has no parallel, I think. I mean, as far as I'm aware, but I'm not really an expert in this kind of comparative history of this kind. But as far as I know from the reading that I've read, that I've done, there is really no parallel to it. A kind of a hierarchical military system, which is called the system of mansabdars. And I'll explain to you very briefly what this system is. Okay, one of the Rajput princes, rulers, who is absorbed into Akbar's empire, okay, is a man called Man Singh. Right? Now, Man Singh is going to be designated a mansabdar. Okay, so mansabdar is a person who has a certain military ranking within this system. And so you are a mansabdar of, for example, 20,000, or a mansabdar of 10,000, or mansabdar of 5,000, which means if you're a mansabdar of 5,000, you are allowed to have a cavalry force of 5,000. If you're a mansabdar of 20,000, you're allowed to have a cavalry force of 20,000 horses. Each of these mansabdars, so people were ranked in the court. Each of the people who is attending to the Mughal emperor from the time of Akbar, okay, from the time of Akbar, is designated a mansabdar. This means that you have a kind of a private army. Of course, the Mughal emperor can call on his mansabdars when he is going to war with a foreign element. Or if he is trying to, let's supposing that, for example, Aurangzeb is going to wage war in the Deccan. He's going to go down south. The war is going to last for years. Okay? Now he is calling upon his mansabdars and saying, you all have to come and partake of this battle with me. Right? And so each of these people will bring their 20,000 horses, and 20,000 horses means 20,000 cavalry, of course, right? Or 10,000. It's a hierarchical system. And the people who are defeated very often will be appointed mansabdars. So it's a complex military hierarchical system which is very effective from the point of view of maintaining that particular empire. Okay? And seventhly, one could add several more things, but I'm going to stop there just because that gives you a bit of a picture of what are the ways in which the Mughals are able to maintain their empire. The seventh and last element that I want to talk about is a complicated system of forts and military installations, okay, throughout the empire. And if you go to Delhi or if you go to Agra today, you can see the Agra fort, which is a huge fort, right? And these forts were big enough, obviously, that there were entire communities living within these forts. But it's a system of military fortifications, system of military installations at strategic points, which is extremely effective. Okay? So these are what I'm describing as the pillars of the Mughal Empire, right? Now, let's go back to Babur. So Babur is going to defeat Ibrahim Lodi at Panipat, as I said, on 19th April 1526. Okay, and I've already mentioned to you what his descent is, what his lineage is from. There is obviously a desire, all the Mughals will have this desire, by the way, to recapture Samarkand. Okay, because Babur himself has now come to India, but there is this dream that you want to capture your ancestral location, right? Akbar will have this dream as well, but he's going to be quite judicious, because one of the things he's going to realize is that the Uzbeks are extremely powerful still. The Uzbeks in Akbar's time are led by a man called Abdullah, right? And Akbar makes a very judicious decision that he's not going to jeopardize his huge Indian empire in the quest for this adventure in Central Asia just to recover Samarkand. But it's a dream that the Mughals are going to have for a substantial period of time, right? So Babur is going to establish himself, and he's going to be the founder of this great empire. His name, unfortunately, in many middle-class Indian homes today is linked with tyranny and oppression. Okay? And you know, the Babri Masjid, which I had discussed, the demolition of the Babri Masjid, you might recall, if for those of you who were here, 1992, right? The same mosque which is said to have been built at the spot where there was a temple dedicated to Lord Ram. Okay, this Babri Masjid is named after Babur, because this mosque is said to have been built at that spot by the orders of the Emperor Babur. And this is one of the reasons why his name is linked with tyranny and oppression in Indian middle class homes. But Babur himself was unquestionably a very enlightened ruler. No question about that. And very learned, extremely learned. Okay, so he writes an autobiography. The first such autobiography, by the way, is called the Babar Nama. Okay, available in a number of excellent translations in English for those of you who are interested, at about 600 pages or thereabouts. The Babar Nama. Okay, he writes it in Turkish, but it's a highly Persianized kind of Turkish. Babur himself was a great aficionado of music, architecture, and you can begin to see the advent of what are called miniature paintings. Okay, some of which you will see when I show you when I have one last slide show sometime later this week or early next week. You're going to be able to see some of these to get some idea of what I'm speaking about over here. And he's going to be able to extend the empire to Afghanistan, okay, of course the Punjab, Delhi, and down south up to the Deccan. Not deep down south, but up to the Deccan, and all the way east up to almost Orissa. All right, this is going to be the extent of the empire of Babur. Now Babur is going to die in 1530. He's going to be succeeded by his son. These people whose names are written down here, this is the line of succession. So Babur is going to be succeeded by Humayun, and Humayun by his son Akbar, and so forth and so on. You might want to just keep these names in mind over here. The succession, by the way, is very often disputed, because in this culture, in the Mughal culture, there's no really rule that the eldest son is necessarily going to succeed. So when you've got a number, so Shah Jahan, for example, has got a number of sons, and there's going to be a brutal war between them for succession. You know, one of his sons is Dara Shikoh, okay, a legendary figure in India, because some people argue, I don't believe in that kind of history, but some people argue that had Dara Shikoh actually, so one of his other son is Dara Shikoh, then he's got a son called Aurangzeb, he's got a number of other sons as well, a couple of other sons, all of them are going to be given important assignments, right? Made governors of such and such provinces. The Mughal emperor is relying upon his sons to maintain the empire. Now when it's quite clear that there has to be some kind of succession, right? So there's going to be a battle, effectively, between the sons. You know, they're going to conspire against each other. And some people have argued that had Dara Shikoh won, the whole history of India would have been different, right? Because Dara Shikoh is supposed to be the representative of the great Mughal syncretic traditions. Aurangzeb is supposed to have been the best example of the intolerant Muslim ruler who pushed the clock back, as Nehru would say in the discovery of India. Okay? Right? This is why that argument is made very often. So the succession is disputed. I'm not going to have time to get into the disputed successions. In the case of Dara Shikoh, it is said that Aurangzeb beheaded his own brother, and his brother's head was brought on a platter to him. Okay, that might be a little bit extravagant, possibly. Okay, but this is what I mean. That it's a story of disputed successions, controversial. We don't need to concern ourselves with that. You just want to keep this line of succession in mind over here. I'm going to continue very briefly with Humayun and then really move on to Akbar and Jahangir and Shah Jahan, because those are the figures that we need to be thinking about as we continue this narrative.